Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Caitlin Clarkson Pereira, and I'm the Executive Director of GVPedia. And we are here tonight to talk about safe storage. And we're really excited to have this session. And we have a fantastic guest who I'm going to introduce you to in a moment. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. We are recording the session, and all guests here are on mute. Some of you submitted questions in the RSVP form, but for any other questions that might come up while we are doing this session, please feel free to put them in the chat box, and we will answer as many of them as we can after the initial part of the presentation. So in a moment, I'm going to introduce you to our presenters, but first, I just want to give a brief introduction to who we are. GVPedia is a comprehensive resource providing public access to our gun study database, which is the largest in existence, including over 1,700 academic studies, and access to GVP University, which is a repository of white papers and fact sheets about gun violence. Both the database and university are easily searchable by subject matter and provide an excellent resource for educational and advocacy purposes. GVP University is also the home to the Firearm Policy Initiative. So I'm excited to introduce you to Devin Hughes, who is the founder of GVPedia, and also to our special guest tonight, Kristen Song, who is the founder of the Ethan Miller Song Foundation, named for her late son, Ethan. We are so fortunate to have Kristen joining us tonight to talk about safe storage and her incredible pursuit to have Ethan's Law, which is a bill for safe storage, passed at the federal level. So now I'm going to turn the presentation over to Devin.
Thank you, Caitlin. Yeah, so I think an excellent way to start this conversation is to talk about Ethan's Law. We'll go a bit into the law, what it hopes to accomplish, and why it's so important. And then also we're going to look into going into the various myths that surround safe storage and how best to counter those myths and provide positive messaging going forward. So Kristen, can you tell us a little bit about Ethan's Law, where it's at in the legislative process and what it hopes to accomplish?
Sure. Thank you guys so much for having me. Ethan's Law really came out of my own personal case when the prosecutor told me that she would not be charging the negligent gun owner who stored 3 handguns and bullets in a shoebox, but instead was going to charge the 14-year-old friend of Ethan's with manslaughter. And in my house, my husband and I, the buck stops with us. We are the adults in the house, and if we bring in dangerous weapons or medication, the onus is really on us to keep our children safe and to keep other children who are visiting our home safe. And so, when we chatted with the prosecutor, she said, the only way that we can start charging gun owners and start changing behavior is to really change the law. And so my husband and I set out to do that in Connecticut. And the first people that we wanted to speak with were the gun owners, because we wanted to create a safe storage law that would actually be effective and would not violate the Second Amendment. And so Ethan's Law is really, if you go into the NRA handbook and look at safe storage, if you go into the NSSF guidelines, that's pretty much what Ethan's Law is. Ethan's Law requires a gun owner to store their weapons if children can gain access to them and unauthorized persons. So for example, if your uncle gets out of jail and now resides with you, it is the onus is on the gun owner to make sure that that person could not gain access to the guns. And so it's really truly just a very simple law. That's really the crux of it. On the federal level, if a police officer is in your home, it's usually for domestic issues and sees a gun that can be accessed by children who are in the home, you may be able to, they may be able to give you a fine up to $500. And the prison penalty only kicks in if a child's been injured or killed. On the federal level, we, with a small group of folks, really led by survivors, have ascertained enough Democratic votes to pass it on the floor. And we are now in the process of trying to push Chairman Nadler, who chairs the Judiciary Committee, to call a hearing. And we're hoping that that will be done during Police Week, which is May 16th. And that we'll have a hearing and a vote on Ethan's Law, and then we'll turn our attention to the Senate.
And I believe I saw an update from your organization that the bill has bipartisan support already.
Chris Smith from New Jersey. I met him right after actually Ethan died, when I was down there advocating, and we were chatting because that was at the time, I'm not sure if you all remember, a student from New Jersey got into a car thinking it was an Uber, and she was murdered. And so they passed Sammy's Law, which it gives Ubers more identification so that, you know, people just don't jump into a car. Actually, my husband and I did the same thing. We jumped into a car thinking it was an Uber. You know, so it happens when you're kind of running around and busy. And so we chatted about how important it was to try to keep our children safe. And so he committed 2 years ago that he would step up and support Ethan's Law. So we bumped into him again, and he was true to his word. So I've met with over 100 Republican offices. I've met with some of the actual senators and representatives themselves, and I've met with a lot of their legislative directors. And, you know, I will tell you that 95% of the offices are, they believe in safe storage. They understand that there is an epidemic right now, that this is the leading cause of death in our children. And the common denominator through suicides, you know, deaths like Ethan's and school shootings is a unsecured firearm. And if we could just create that cultural shift where gun owners, when they come home, you know, and they take that gun off their person, stop and think about who besides them can gain access to their gun. I think we can dramatically drive down the deaths in children.
Kind of going off that, can you give us a sense of how big a problem safe storage is in the United States? Because, well, like you mentioned, like with the NRA and NSF, like their materials are like, please store your gun safely, but then it's clear that many don't. So what's the scope of that?
Yeah, so right now, 5.4 million children are living in a home with one loaded unsecured gun. You know, the statistics are a little bit all over. You know, about 8 children a day on average are dying because they gained access to a gun. And the majority of those are suicides. You know, and so I've had the displeasure of speaking to many, many parents over the last 4 years. And I will tell you, the parents whose children use their own family gun to commit suicide have never once said to me, I'm so glad I didn't store my gun. You know, they beat themselves up because in 30 seconds, a minute, if they had stored that gun, that child most likely would have gotten through that crisis, you know, which, you know, I mean, we all look back, you know, when that boyfriend first breaks up with you, you know, as a teenager, you know, you never think you're going to get over it. And I actually just spoke to a mom from Long Island. Exact thing happened. Her son, the girlfriend broke up with him, and he just was completely devastated and took the family gun and walked to the beach and committed suicide. He was 17 years old. He had just gotten into college. So those are the things that we're trying to prevent. And it is a problem. It is the leading cause of death in our children right now. It has surpassed cancer. It has surpassed overdoses, and it has surpassed car accidents.
And also, just to provide a statistical sense of kind of the impact safe storage can have, such laws like Ethan's focus on unintentional shootings, suicides, and they also have the beneficial side effect of helping prevent gun thefts. So looking at like the unintentional and suicide deaths among children and teenagers, from a global perspective, children and teenagers in the US are 8 to 10 times more likely to die from firearm injuries than children in other high-income countries like those in Europe. And one of the main causes of this is that about 50% of gun owners, depending on the poll, do not store at least one of their firearms safely. So it's out in the open, potentially loaded, and can unfortunately be easily accessed. And for children, this often leads to unintentional deaths, even when children are told over and over again, like, don't play with the guns. Well, when adults aren't around, there have been multiple studies that show that many children do in fact play with the guns, and that leads to horrific consequences. And as Kristen just mentioned, with teenage suicide, like, these are formative years that can, particularly now with the pandemic, lead to very high rates of distress, emotional distress, and anxiety, depression. And one of the things that the statistics overwhelmingly tell us is that a firearm in the home dramatically increases the risk of suicide. And that risk goes up when the firearm is not safely secured for these kids. And it's truly horrible in that regard. And another one of the benefits, as I mentioned earlier, for safe storage is reducing gun theft. There are an estimated 380,000 firearms that are stolen annually in the US. And a large number of those come from private homes, but also from cars and just gun owners leaving guns around. And if a firearm is safely stored in a safe, any thief is not going to have the time or tools on them to break into that safe, most likely. And so all those guns that are stolen end up on the streets in some form later on and can cause a horrific amount of damage. And so that's another benefit of these laws that isn't frequently touted and isn't the main purpose of the law, but it still has a substantially positive impact there. And so with all those benefits in mind, one of the things I'm wondering is what sort of pushback you're encountering from safe storage, because like you mentioned, like the NRA, the NSSF, and all responsible gun owners, one would think, would want to store their firearms safely. So where's the pushback coming from?
I think truthfully, I mean, to be completely honest with you, because I've had very candid conversations with Republican offices and with NRA members and NSSF. Joe Bartozzi and my husband and I have spoken, pretty frequently, and he's the president and CEO of the NSSF. I think they're afraid of one piece of legislation getting passed and it becoming a floodgate, and so I think their position is zero tolerance for any kind of gun legislation being passed, which is a shame because I truly believe that just like drunk driving, when we had MAD, that was during my time. When I went to college, if you drove drunk, there was almost no consequences. It actually was kind of a funny thing that you'd say, how did you get home last night? That changed. And that changed because MAD came in, changed because people were dying and people were tired of it. And so when we created stricter drunk driving laws, that cultural shift started. And I just looked at the statistic today. Children under the age of 21 now, there's an 83% drop in deaths because my young children, that's not part of who they are. That cultural shift came full cycle. And so kids who are, in their early 20s, when you say to them, please don't, drink and drive, my kids look at me like I'm crazy. Like, who does that? Well, we did, because in college, there wasn't a big deal. And so that's kind of like the cultural shift we're looking for. And I think if we create that, I think the temperature in this country is going to come way down. I think because there's going to be less pain in this country, there's going to be, under the Trump administration, the Secret Service did a study, 76% of all guns come from home or a relative's home. Can you imagine if just the school shootings alone stopped? I mean, this country would be in such a better position to start working together. Whenever we start talking to any groups, my husband and my position has always been, we come to you as a parent. I'm not coming to you as a Democrat, Republican, gun owner, non-gun owner. I'm coming to you as a parent to speak to you on that level, because I don't see this as a partisan issue. I think when it comes to saving our children and protecting them, I think that's an all us issue. And I think that it's imperative we work together to make sure that we can do that.
Yeah, it always surprises me with the slippery slope argument, because one of the things we've seen over the past really 2 to 3 decades has been a slippery slope in the opposite direction, where particularly like with concealed carry laws, well, at first you needed a permit, and then that would have the police involved. And then it moved to, well, we're going to remove police discretion. Then we're going to remove training slowly, bit by bit, and then no need for a permit at all. Or you have cases like with stand your ground laws, where initially it was like you have a castle doctrine in the home, you're able to protect yourself. Then it keeps getting extended further and further to where in many cases you can shoot first and ask questions later. And it kind of comes all into this defensive gun use culture. And this is something GVPedia has talked about quite frequently, where there's this mythos of widespread defensive gun use, whereas the best available data we have from the Gun Violence Archive indicates that there are 2,000 verified defensive gun uses annually. So guns are being used far more in harmful circumstances than in beneficial circumstances. I'm kind of wondering how often defensive gun use comes up, and the idea that, well, if I have a gun safely stored somewhere, I'm not going to be able to access it when I truly need it, and that sort of mentality.
You know what, that argument, really kind of went away, because, when the Heller case was decided, the technology was, complicated safes and trigger locks where you'd have to go find the key. Well, now our technology has advanced to such a degree that, we have probably 4 or 5 safes in our house right now. The biometric safes and the PIN code safes, they open up faster than you can probably open up your cell phone to call 911. And so that argument has kind of dropped away, because really gun owners understand that they can now gain access to their handgun to protect their family, but at the same time, protect them from the internal dangers in their home. And really, the majority of gun owners that I've met have been very, very responsible gun owners. And so this law doesn't really even impact them, because they're already storing their weapons securely. They're already making sure that the only hands that access their guns are ones that they have given permission to. So that argument, we don't get a lot. We do get, like, we'd rather educate, than regulate. And I listen, I love education. I am a huge supporter of education. And that's why in Connecticut, we added that provision in Ethan's law to create an educational guide about gun safety, because I agree that it will absolutely reach some people, but unfortunately, it's not going to reach everyone. And we can just look through history. We can use drunk driving again. We educated, we had PSAs, we had marketing, they had everything. They spent millions and millions of dollars to educate people not to drink and drive. There's some people who still got in that car and they drove when they were drinking, and they caused catastrophic results. And so, unfortunately, sometimes you have to have a little bit of teeth in a law to get everyone's attention so that they, create that cultural shift. So I'm all for education, but unfortunately that's not going to reach everyone. And, in our case, the father was a highly educated gun owner. His son, in fact, his son had his NRA safety 100, scored 100 on his safety test, framed, and they hung it in their living room. So this was a family that had guns their entire lives. He grew up with guns, and yet he still loaded the gun, and was practicing loading and unloading the gun, and didn't realize that a bullet can get caught in the chamber. And I understand that. He's 14 years old. He didn't understand that could happen. And so and then you add boy energy, boy teenage brain, boy risky behavior. And, that's another thing that I always chat with all offices about. If you can honestly tell me that in your teenage years that you never engaged in any risky behavior, you really should write a book, because I think a lot of parents would read that. It's just not realistic. Children are, especially teenage boys, the definition of them is risky behavior, being stupid, doing things that, as a parent, you shake your head and say, what were you thinking? And so, that's not going to work for everybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember being a teenager, and I grew up in a gun-owning family as well. We had a rifle and a shotgun. We lived out in Jones, Oklahoma, which is basically in the middle of nowhere. And the police response time was like, well, you need to contact the 2 police officers, and then hopefully one of them is on duty. And so 30 minutes later, they show up. But like, neither of the guns were ever meant for defensive gun use. We had a big German Shepherd for that. And I didn't know where the guns were stored and would never encounter them. Like, the one time I was shown them, and then off they went again, and which was a very good thing, because like, even though I like to think that I was a very good kid, I was also an idiot as a teenager, as we all tend to be.
Yeah.
And there have been studies that have shown, like particularly with younger kids, where researchers would actually walk them through like the Eddie Eagle program and others that are designed to educate kids. And they would find that afterwards, the kids could recite back what they were supposed to do, but then they'd put the kids in like controlled space and have like a facsimile of a gun there that looked real. And the kids, sure enough, would go and play with the gun more than half the time, because like, the Eddie Eagle rules were in the past, the gun's right here ready to be played with. And
yeah, and we see that, listen, we all educate our kids about, premarital sex, doing drugs, drinking too much, hazing, driving too fast, don't tailgate, don't have friends in the car, don't play. I mean, you can go on and on. And how many times have you as a teenager, and how many times have you as a parent caught your child doing something that you just spent so much time educating them about and talking about and lecturing them about and engaging them? It's just the nature of the brain at that point. It's not fully developed. And unfortunately, there's a lot of kids who are, are risk takers, and and that's how we still end up with a lot of tragedies, unfortunately.
Because one of the lines so often is like, well, my kid is responsible and knows not to do that. But that's almost every kid in these situations, is that the parents think they know and they just don't.
Ethan and I were probably the closest out of my 3 children. We were very similar in personalities. I thought I knew my children. I was a stay-at-home mom. I spent an inordinate amount of time with them. I went to every school event, every sporting event. We talked, we had family dinners every night. We went on family vacations. I made it my job to make sure that I knew what was going on. I knew their friends. When we arrived at the hospital, we had no idea if Ethan was alive or dead. I thought he got hit by a car. When the police came to my house, I thought he must have gotten hit by a car. And when the ER doctor walked in to the room where we were, my husband and I were waiting, he slid down the wall and he just put his head in his hands and just whispered, your son is gone. And, I remember dropping down in a fetal position and just praying to God to take me instead. And I remember hearing my husband asking, how did he die? How did he die? And the last thing I would have ever imagined coming out of that doctor's mouth was he was shot. Because I knew where he was. He was in a neighbor's house that we knew for 10 years. This, his best friend was part of our family. Unfortunately, his best friend was parading his friends through the house. You know, Ethan was not the only child that handled the guns. There was a lot of the boys that did. Kind of became a thing in our town. And they were posting up to social media and getting 100 likes. And so they thought as freshman boys that they were it. They arrived. And the fact that none of those children ever stepped up and told anyone, you know, we had a couple of months to save Ethan, and nobody said a word. So, you know, I know it sounds very cliche, but if it could happen to a mom who was all in, a family who was all in, you know, it can happen to you.
One of the arguments that often comes up, particularly when it's family's child that like shot themselves, or another kid in the family, is like, oh, haven't the parents suffered enough? Like, why put a penalty on it because they're going through such unimaginable grief already? So how do you respond?
And that's I mean, listen, if that's going to be the case, then it has to be across the board. Then we need to start taking risk of injury to a minor off. We need to, you know, I just just read about a mom who failed to secure her child into a car seat, and they got into a car accident and the child died. You know, she's in prison because not because you want to punish the parent even more, because there has to be some accountability, and we have to send the message out to all the other parents. Hey, listen, it is really important for you to secure your child, because this is what happens if you don't. And so it's just the same philosophy, you know. If you don't put a fence around your pool and your child drowns, you're going to be charged with risk of injury to a minor. You're going to be charged for that child's death. If you leave opioids on a table and your child gets into them, the likelihood is you're going to be charged for that. And I don't understand why, when it comes to guns, we've carved out this special exception for those parents. It actually baffles me, because this is why we're where we are. This is why we're in the position we are at this point, and why it's the leading cause of death in children.
Yeah, and it's always weird because you'll see, for example, when a mother leaves her kid in the hot car, and like off the mother goes to prison, and there's not like even a word of like sympathy there. It's like recognized, like, look, this was extremely negligent. The parents need to know better, and we need to let others know that this is a risk. So it gets people to double check in the car seat behind them, just to make sure.
Exactly.
So that idea raises up, this is a risk that we need to address. And like you mentioned, it's not about punishment. It's about raising awareness that this is a major problem. And if it's not taken seriously, and there's this great 2018 study by Dr. Hamilton that came out that compared strong child access prevention laws like Ethan's law and weaker laws that don't establish a penalty. And they found that strong child access prevention laws reduce unintentional shootings and suicides among minors by a substantial margin. And states with weaker laws actually saw their rates go up. And we've actually talked with the author about that. And it's not, they don't think that the weak laws cause these sort of shootings to go up, but that overall it sends a signal to society that this is not a problem worth caring about or taking seriously. And as you've mentioned, the only real way to change the culture on this, because if the culture could have changed, it would already be there because everybody rational is in agreement, like safely storing firearms is crucial.
Yeah.
And yet we're not there yet.
Yeah.
And so there has to be some form of legislative action. And that actually kind of reminds me, because I say everybody rational, but there actually are arguments out there that my guess is further on to the legislative process you might encounter, where like there's one study by our perennial friend John Lott that says that child access prevention laws increase crime, because then burglars know that oh, somebody's storing their firearm, they won't be able to access it, which is just insane. And also, the study was done a couple decades ago. And even if it was true then, which there's no reason to believe, multiple studies refuted it, it's not true now because, like you mentioned with the biometric safe, like you can like put your finger over it, it's open. That takes 1 to 2 seconds. Like
Yeah.
there's
And
no excuse now.
And that's honestly, some of the gun owners I spoke to said what they do is they bolt the biometric safe, to their nightstand, because that's generally when they want to make sure that they have access to a gun really, really quickly. And they used to sleep with it underneath their pillow, or they used to sleep with it on their nightstand. And I remember one gun owner telling me, I have 3 daughters under the age of 9. It never dawned on me that one of my daughters would come in during the night and actually might gain access to my gun. He was so prideful that he was protecting his family, that he was he was what was going to be in between the burglar and his children, and he was going to make sure that he protected them. And it just never dawned on him that he was actually putting his, potentially could be putting his children in danger. So that was actually in Connecticut. He was actually a Republican representative, and he actually tracked me down after Ethan's Law was passed and shared that story with me, because he was thankful that he actually sat and listened and didn't automatically go to his corner because it was the gun legislation, and he actually just sat and pondered it and listened to it and talked to his wife, and he said, this is an absolute must. So that's what I mean about going in and talking to all of these offices just as a conversation, and not as, lecturing or belittling or shaming or, whatever. It's a conversation. We're building relationships with people so that we don't just take our respective corners and stop talking, because unfortunately what's happening is our children are paying the price.
Yeah. I'm going to be opening it up to audience questions in a moment, but kind of before then, those stories remind me that my grandmother, and this was back in the 80s, there had been a rash of break-ins in her neighborhood, and she decided she needed to protect herself from that. So never owned a gun before, but she decided to get like the Smith & Wesson revolver, I think it was. And she put it just like in a cabinet somewhere. And she goes out one night and comes back. And now my grandmother lived like a Spartan, to where it's like bare bones, everything, like radio's not worth having, TV's not worth having. And so she comes home to discover that she had been broken into. And she looks around, and the only thing that the robbers stole was the firearm. And after that, I was like, yeah, well, no more guns there. But it's so often far more of an inducement to theft. And there's this study by Philip Cook, I believe, done in the early 2000s, where they looked at rates of gun ownership and compared it with rates of burglary. And they found that gun ownership was an inducement because it was recognized on the open market that these weapons are easy to conceal, easy to take somewhere, have great cash value, and are virtually untraceable due to our massive laws at the federal level. And so that's yet another case where it's not just the danger in the home, and firearms double your risk of homicide, triple your risk of suicide in the home, but it's also fueling the epidemic of violence outside of the home as well.
I think we can really have a strong Second Amendment, and we can have a strong, child safety laws. I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think that's why I think Ethan's Law is so appealing to so many people, because it really protects the Second Amendment. Just like you said, if you're storing your guns aren't getting stolen. That's protecting your Second Amendment. That you're keeping your guns in your home. You're keeping your guns with you so that you can use them for protection. But at the same time, you're protecting your children and other children who are coming into your home, grandchildren. I was on a call the other night, and a grandmother was telling me how her grandchildren came to visit, and she forgot she had a loaded firearm in her nightstand drawer. And her granddaughter went in and was more interested in the jewelry that was sitting next to the gun, and came out into the kitchen with the jewelry. And she said, "Oh my God, I just totally forgot that I had a loaded gun in my nightstand." And so those are the things that we're trying to do, just elevate the conversation, elevate, people stopping and thinking about, where is that firearm?
Yeah. One of the questions in chat talks about that, I guess it was in Maryland, where like one of the arguments in testimony was that it's not fair to lock up guns if you're not required to lock up like drugs, knives, or anything else. And then another argument that came up was that the safes cost too much. So how do you kind of respond to both of those arguments when they come up?
Well, so we had a long conversation about that when we were kind of drafting Ethan's law, because they were kind of pushing for like tax credit. And honestly, tax credit to me, you gotta remember to hold on to your receipt. Then you gotta remember that, tax time to file it. And so, we kind of came up with, let's just have grant money. And so there's grant money associated with Ethan's law. And what it will do is it'll flow through your particular community, and you'll have the discretion, so your community may decide that education is more of a key for our community. You may decide biometric safes are the way to go. If we can hand out 1,000 biometric safes, that's what we'd like to do with our money. And so we kind of really left it up to, each individual community to figure out what works best for them. Because I appreciate that. I always say, gun safes, biometric gun safes on Amazon cost less than a car seat. And I don't ever really hear a lot of pushback with people complaining that they have to spend, $80 to have a car seat that could save your child's life.
And like one of the other kind of things that makes it like a slightly less than honest argument is that to be a responsible gun owner anyway, like guns cost a substantial amount of money. Ammunition costs a substantial amount of money. Training costs money. And so it's like all these things are costing money, and like you have dozens upon dozens of guns, but where you draw the line at the expense ratio is like keeping them safe. Like that just doesn't really compute.
Believe me, you do not want to be in my shoes. You do not want to be penny wise, pound foolish. You do not want to say, listen, I'm not going to spring for a $80 safe, because that's not where I want to spend my money, and have your child commit suicide, or someone else's child come into your home, or your child who's in crisis walk into a school and commit a school shooting. I'm telling you, this is not a life you want to be living. It's just not. It's the pain, the sadness, the fact that your life will never be the same, the continued worry that I have every day that my other two children will start self-medicating or become destructive in their lives, because we were an extremely close-knit family. $100, if someone said to me, if you could spend $100 on a safe and your child would be alive and it's a freshman in college right now, I'd spend it 1,000 times over, because this is not what you want to be pinching pennies over.
You've talked about a lot of the kind of positive reactions from gun owners and legislators who highlight the importance of safe storage, even if they don't agree with it being a legislative path. What are like the most common negative interactions that you've had, or the points that come up to where they kind of disagree even with the safe storage premise?
I think we've only had maybe I actually had one conversation today, and a lot, and I've had probably two with offices. One was in Arkansas and one was in Texas, and they were very rural areas. And so they didn't feel like they saw a lot of children being killed with guns. It's not a highly densely populated, community. And they just weren't raised like that. They were raised that the guns were out and available, and that children didn't touch them. And so, you still have a lot of that conversation that needs to happen, because I think back in the day when we were growing up, gun sales, were minimal compared to what they've now become. I know that 1 month last year, 2.5 million guns were sold in a month. That's, astronomically much higher than it was when, I was growing up as a child. So, and truthfully, a lot of the guns that are being bought now are not by people who grew up with guns. They're not by people who were raised by their grandparents and their father to respect and store a gun. They're being bought by people like my brother, who bought 4 guns, and I don't think has ever taken them to the shooting range. I don't think he's ever went for any kind of education about them. But he now feels like he can protect his family with 4 guns that he really has no business, handling, because he just really hasn't put the time or effort into being trained. And so I think a lot of those guns are being sold to a lot of people who, they just don't have the training background or the family heritage. So that's really worrisome too.
And there's even a couple papers that kind of separate gun culture into like gun culture 1.0 and 2.0, and where like the original gun culture was very much about hunting and having that kind of be the core of it, or even like target shooting, whereas today it's very much centered around self-protection. And oftentimes there's kind of the sense with guns that they're almost like a magic wand, in a way where it's like, all I need to do is have this gun, and then no matter what happens, I'll be safe and be able to protect myself and everybody with it. And it's just not the case.
Yeah,
like
I mean, think about the military. When you join the military, you're not even allowed to touch your assault rifle until you've passed all your training. And if you don't pass, there's times where you're not even allowed to handle your assault rifle. And then they keep it under lock and key, right? All those guns are locked away. And my understanding from speaking to the veterans in the active military is that a lot of times they'll have guards guarding the guns to make sure that they're locked up and that no one accesses them without, permission. Police officers go through how many years of training to be able to fire properly with their guns, or, to know when to fire, not to fire. And there's still mistakes, made there, because we are humans. The Sutherland shooting, when I testified in front of the Senate, they had him testifying against Ethan's Law. And it was kind of interesting because that gentleman basically was a sharpshooter. He had done so much training through his years. That's why he felt confident taking aim and shooting the shooter from far away. But that's not the majority of Americans. And at the end of his testimony, he did say, well, if there was grandchildren or children in his home, that all of his guns would be locked away. And so in the end, he agreed with Ethan's Law. So even people who are staunch advocates of, arguing against Ethan's Law, really in the end agree with Ethan's Law, because nobody wants a child to gain access to a gun and injure themselves or kill themselves or kill other children.
Yeah, and with police and military, like there's actually this drill called the Tuller drill, where you have to fire 2 shots in 2 seconds at a target 20 feet away. And the reason it's 20 feet away is that's the average distance somebody can cross in 2 seconds, basically. And 20 feet is quite far away. And police have gone through this drill over and over and over again, to where they have their reactions, to where they can use the firearm like that. And even then, and that's like in an almost ideal self-defense situation, but then you look at police officer accuracy rates in public, and you're lucky if like 1/10 of the shots are going anywhere near the target. And those are people who have gone through far more extensive training than you need to carry a gun, even in states that still have training for that. And then with the military, there is a study out of Israel where they, like our military, had a suicide epidemic. And they realized that many of these suicides were occurring when soldiers would bring their guns home with them from the base on weekends. And they instituted a policy where you could no longer bring your military firearms home with you on weekends. And sure enough, overall suicides plummeted in the aftermath of this simple policy change. And so I think one of the things that people tend not to recognize as well is the threat of suicide here, because it's all about like, oh, if there's an intruder or some situation like that, but very often the threats within as well. And unfortunately, I think this is still the case as well. Like officers in the US military aren't even able to ask soldiers about personal firearms, even if they think that there's a risk there. And while this is somewhat tangential to the child access prevention law, I think it kind of shapes into this overall cultural norm that needs to shift to recognize that, like, look, we need safe storage and we need to treat firearms as a danger here. And that just hasn't been happening because I had
a conversation with a father of a veteran who was suffering very severely from PTSD. And I remember talking to his dad about, well, you should probably step up and just hold his guns temporarily until he can get through this crisis. And I remember the dad saying, "Are you kidding me? That's his Second Amendment right to have those guns." And I remember saying to him, like, so do you think his daughter would rather dance with her father at her wedding, or do you think she'd rather dance with his gun at her wedding? Because that's really what it's coming down to. I can speak from personal experience. After Ethan died, I was suicidal, and I am so lucky that I did not have a gun in the house, because I was frantic to make sure I could stop the pain. And my other son recognized in me that I was in crisis, and thankfully I did not have the means, because I will tell you, the moment I decided that I was going to leave this world, I felt relieved. I felt like, wow, I can be out of this pain and I can be with Ethan. And so it is very dangerous, because I'm an adult who, had a very stable, upbringing. I had a lot of coping skills, and I still contemplated suicide. So it really is, it is an impulsive, it is something where you feel like you are never going to feel better or have a future. And I'm lucky. I'm just lucky to be here, because I have 2 other children and I have a husband. And truthfully, my son, when he recognized I was in crisis, grabbed my hand and said, "Mom, if I lose another member of this family, I'm following you. I'm going to be right behind you." And so at that moment, I knew I had to live. I knew that I had no other choice but to fight. And so it really is imperative that people really do take it to heart. If you're not the suicidal person, please believe me that when you have someone in crisis, they're going to do something that you're going to shake your head and say, "I just never in a million years thought that person would do that." So I know 21 veterans a day are still dying by suicide. And so we owe it to them for their service to our country, to keep them safe too.
And one of the things that so often comes up that people don't recognize is just how even with like long-term suicidal ideation, how impulsive the decision to commit suicide so often is. because there's this talking point that frustrates the heck out of me. That's like, oh, they'll just find another way. And it's like, no, that's not true. It's a moment of crisis where things break and you feel that like the pain just must stop. And people search then for what's around them. And if that happens to be a firearm, lethality is a crucial element of it, because more than 90% of attempted firearm suicides are completed where the person dies. Whereas if it's pills or almost any other method, it's 5, 10, 15, 20%. And while people who attempt suicide once are still at a much elevated risk of attempting again, still more than 90% of people who survive an initial suicide attempt go on to never commit suicide again. So if you can stop somebody from at that moment of crisis from taking their own life, you're likely saving their life for as long as their natural life. And
I had
just
a mom from my hometown after Ethan died. They were gun owners, and she locked up her guns. And she called me probably about 2 months ago. Her son tried to commit suicide. And she was calling me because she was thanking me, because she knew that if those guns were accessible, that he would have been successful, and that she had at least an hour to save her child. So she was able to get her child down to the hospital, and they were able to pump his stomach and get him the help he needs. So you're absolutely right. Guns are they're very successful. They are very successful at what they were built to do. And so it is imperative that we make sure that, anyone in crisis can't gain access to a gun.
Kristen, I've received a lot of great questions here, and unfortunately, we're not going to have time for many of them tonight. But what we know that you're making your final pushes in DC. Some people are asking me what we can do here for you and for Ethan's Law.
Absolutely call your representative and your senator. I will tell you, I know people tell me all the time, oh, please, no one listens. They do listen. They actually track it. They actually track the emails and they track the calls. And it really is, we've had a couple of Democrats in more conservative districts who did hear from their constituents and then stepped up and signed on to co-sponsor Ethan's Law. So they really do want to hear from you. And so I would really implore you to just fire off an email, or just leave a message, or just call their office and just let them know that you support Ethan's Law. Because right now we are at that tipping point. Right now is when Nancy Pelosi is going to decide whether Ethan's Law gets a hearing and whether we get a vote. So the more noise we can make, the more cover we can give them, so that they feel more comfortable that this is something that the country wants, the more likely it's going to happen.
And to add on to that, are there any petitions or websites that people can visit to where they have those tools and can be more direct in their assistance?
Yeah, there's Caitlin, I sent it to you. Can you find that link? It's a petition going around right now, and it's going to be submitted to Nancy, Speaker Pelosi, asking her to call a vote for Ethan's Law.
I believe you sent that to me. Is that the Action Network one as well?
I don't know. I can't remember who sent it out, but we're going to present her with the signatures, and hopefully she'll get her fired up to get something accomplished.
I have it here. Oh, Devin just put it in the one. Okay.
Yeah. It says Ethan's Law on it, so I assume it's the correct one.
Yes. And I did it. I hadn't done it yet. I did it before we got on the call tonight. It literally takes like not even 20 seconds. So, and it's got a substantial number of signatures, over 2,000, I think, already. So that's great. Are
there still petitions that organizations can sign on to as well, or has that window closed?
That's the petition that's going around right now.
Okay.
We're meeting with, what's so great is we've been able to, I met with the president twice over Ethan's Law, and he's all in, and now we're asking him to lean in. We've met with some of his senior advisors. They're all in. The Democrats are pretty much all in. And so, that's why I've been taking the time to speak to any Republican office that would give me the opportunity to chat with them. Because although we have the votes in the House, it is so important to me that this legislation be bipartisan, that we stand as Americans shoulder to shoulder, and we send a loud message out that, you can have your Second Amendment. You just need to make sure that that gun is for your use only, or for, someone that you give permission to use. Because this country's in a lot of pain right now, from the school shootings, from so many suicides. We need to start healing. We need to start bringing this country back together and fighting for our children.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for giving us your time tonight. I know you have a very busy schedule. You actually have other things on your agenda to do right after this.
I do.
And for carving out an hour to be with us. I've saved the chat questions, so I can't make promises to everyone with Kristen's time, but I'll try to get some of those questions to her, and if she can, we can get some.
And feel
an
free,
email, I can always forward.
Yep. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions too. You can, Facebook message me or go to songstrong.org. I'm happy to chat with anyone.
And this week we will also be sending out a follow-up email to have some more resources that we've been speaking about this evening. And as always, please share those with your networks on social media, forward our emails, however you'd like, just so that we can get the word out, not only about safe storage, but about Ethan's Law at the federal level as well. So
Thank you so much for being here, Kristen.
Thank you, guys. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Be safe, everyone.